We're well. Actually, Elmarie, I'm going to just kind of turn things over to you. I've got, well, I'll be here I'll wait for Stephanie to get back. I've got a funeral this afternoon, so I got an extra ball to juggle today.
Yeah, it's a busy season, isn't it?
Well, tell us, are you stateside right now?
Yeah, so Scott and I are here in the US to be able to meet with churches. And because of the continuing pandemic, our national offices have asked us to meet virtually with churches, but to try and do that from Lebanon, given the situation there, is not very feasible. So we were able to receive approval to come to the US. And
y'all are based in Lebanon?
I'm sorry?
Y'all are based in Lebanon?
Yeah, we are based in Beirut, Lebanon. So some of you have been traveling with us for the whole 8.5, almost 9 years that we've been in this work. And we're very grateful for the First Presbyterian Church family and your all's collaboration with us over the years. And we've been based in Beirut, Lebanon that whole time, serving with partners in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, really being a relational bridge between our partners there and all of you, just back and forth in those conversations and opportunities to learn.
Well, forgive me if you've already spoken about this last week, but I mean, you've had a front row seat for kind of the pretty, what sounds like from the news, pretty catastrophic situation in Lebanon.
Yeah, and that's actually what I'm going to focus on today, is the situation that has unfolded in Lebanon over the last 2.5 years now. Scott, when he met with all of you last week, and some of you may have been there for the conversation with him as well, he was emphasizing the work in trauma resiliency that he is part of with one of our partners, Middle East Council of Churches, through a program called Strong Kids, Strong Emotions. And then he's also been asked by 2 other partners to share those same trauma resiliency skills with their staff and students. So that's a key part of the work of our partners right now. And Scott is deeply involved in that work. So that was the focus last week. And this week, we're going to widen the lens and take a little bit higher level view, so to speak, bird's eye view of what's been going on and how all of that happened, and the work of our partners in the midst of that. So I'm happy to jump into that. But before I do, just want to see if there's any other questions on the front end that I can make sure to address as we go through this.
I have a question.
Oh, yes.
I have done a lot of reading in the last few years about Israel-Palestine. And in your comments, I would just be interested in your perceptions about the role that Israel has played in creating some of the disruption, and also on the other end, the role the United States has played in Iraq in creating that disruption and there, and how that's affected Lebanon and Syria. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Lane, for that question. There's definitely a lot of intersections, so to speak, between the role of both the U.S. and Israel in the region, and the impact that has on the partners and countries in which we serve. So I'll definitely weave that in. Thank you for raising that. Anything else that is on your hearts and minds as we begin our conversation? Okay, what I'm going to do is share my screen and in that, be able to share a PowerPoint. Let me get rid of a few things here that are distracting. Okay. Is that showing for all of you?
Yes.
Good. Okay. As we've been reflecting on and living in the midst of what's been happening in Lebanon over these last few years, we've really been drawn to this idea of treasure in the ordinary. So much of the Lebanon that we've known in the 6.5 years prior or 5.5 years prior is completely different than what we've been experiencing. And we find that that is the case for our neighbors and friends and colleagues and partners in Lebanon as well. We regularly hear from them that never, even at the worst of the 15-year civil war in Lebanon from 1975 to 1990, never even during the worst period of that war were things as desperate and just cataclysmic as they are now. So that says a lot coming from the experience of people who have endured a tremendous amount of a challenge over the years. There's an art piece that captures what we have tried to be about during these years of really looking for how God is active in the midst of these catastrophic events and the ways in which we see that in the lives of our partners and friends and neighbors. You can see on your screen this shattered glass, and it has gold leaf on its jagged edges. This is a piece of visual art created by a local artist, Stephanie Sade, and it was on virtual display 1 year after the Beirut port explosion. So in remembrance of that horrendous event that happened in August of 2020. And what she says about this is that every living thing has two natures, what you can easily see and that which is hidden. And in the brokenness of this glass with the gold on its edges, what's revealed is the treasure that is within what is broken. And this reminded me of Paul's words to the church in Corinth out of 2 Corinthians chapter 4, where he speaks about the treasure that we have in clay jars, meaning the amazing gift of the triune God through Jesus Christ at work in us to bring life in the midst of whatever is happening around us, no matter how catastrophic it might be. And that reference to clay jars, that we experience ourselves as fragile. And that is so true, especially when we are in times of tremendous challenge. We're aware of our own fragility. And I think all of us have gotten a taste of that during this pandemic. And yet still, the gift of God is in us to be a blessing to the community around us. This also resonates with the Presbyterian Mission Agency's focus on being a Matthew 25 community, really drawing from the last parable in Matthew 25, where Jesus is speaking to the gathered nations, and he talks about the sheep being on his right, those who recognize Christ in the most vulnerable and served them. And served the most vulnerable, not even recognizing that that is where Jesus is found. And to the goats on his left, saying, you completely ignored the marginalized and the most vulnerable. And so in doing that, you ignored me. And so we're really seeking as a community of Presbyterians around the country to be more and more people who recognize and serve alongside of, learn from, and be concerned about those who have less than we. However much we may have, or however least we may have, there are still others that are more marginalized and vulnerable than we are. And so it's in light of that, those three pieces that I want to share with you, what we have seen and experienced and learned from our partners over these last few years in Lebanon. We've certainly not ever been in a situation where we have lived in a country that has been in a complete free fall and collapse. And yet that is what has happened in Lebanon starting in 2019. A lot of this was set in motion in March of 2019 when the Lebanese government for the first time defaulted on its debt. And so when we hear in the United States that our Congress is wrangling about raising the debt limit, we have experienced the very real implications of what happens when a country defaults on its debt, does not pay its bills. And it is horrific. It is not a situation that any country should have to be in. And yet, for the first time, Lebanon did default. And a lot of that is due to what the very wealthy in Lebanon have done in terms of really hoarding public resources for their own use and their own families, and not using that for the good of the country. When that happened, a lot of those who hold the greatest amount of wealth in Lebanon, and though Lebanon is a very small country, it has one of the highest percentages per capita of billionaires. You did hear that right, billionaires. And they began drawing their funds out of the Lebanese banking system, which then led to a lot of panic, to put it mildly. There were several other events that happened in the fall that then resulted in the Lebanese people as a whole rising up in revolution. And I'm going to show you some pictures of what that meant for the people in Lebanon in just a moment. So we have an economic collapse that was underway. The revolution called for the resignation of the political class in total. What that did lead to is the resignation of the prime minister at the time and his cabinet. And then there was a lot of political chaos after that. So you have an economic collapse, political chaos that happened. That's all in the fall of 2019. There was a new government that was designated in December and January of 2020. They just got underway in addressing the economic issues in Lebanon, and then the COVID-19 global pandemic hit, and that consumed all of their energy. It is one thing that they actually have managed well, all things considered. But like every other country around the world, the pandemic has also had an economic impact. And that added to what was already in motion in Lebanon in terms of this collapse. So you have those three tsunami catastrophic events that were happening, and then the Beirut port explosion in August of 2020, which devastated a good third of the city of Beirut. It left over 300,000 people without housing instantaneously. And that has not been fully addressed in any way, shape, or form yet. So at that point in time, the government that was in place, that had been in place since January, resigned. And then it took another 13 months, not until September of 2021, for a new government to be put into place. So all of this crazy economic stuff is happening, and only a caretaker government that cannot make any decisions. They can only carry forward what was already in place. So let me share a little bit about the reality of what this has meant for people. On the wall here, you see some street art. And this is something that we have seen more and more of in Beirut, is street art that is expressing the pain and heartache and frustration and anguish of the people. This is street art that we would never have seen 2.5 years ago, ever. Lebanon was a comfortably middle-class country, deeply impacted by the war in Syria in terms of receiving half again of its population in refugees from Syria. So a country of a little over 4 million Lebanese citizens received somewhere in the ballpark of 2 million Syrian refugees. And yet still, Lebanon was a comfortably middle-class country for all of those years of the war in Syria. But today, there are Lebanese who are on the streets begging because they have lost jobs. They have been frozen out of their bank accounts. Everything that they have worked for decades has just disappeared. And so for the first time, you're seeing men like this father who are on the streets shining shoes to try and earn a few lira in order to buy food for their family for that day. Never have grown men been doing this kind of work in Lebanon. This has always been the avenue for young Syrian boys to earn some extra money, but not grown men. Some of our friends are sharing how more and more they are seeing Lebanese on the streets begging. Lebanese senior adults especially are impacted by this, and to see men and women who lived their whole lives with a tremendous sense of dignity now having to dig through dumpsters to find food is, there's just not enough words to describe how awful that is. Our neighbors, we live in a blue-collar, middle-class community, or at least it has been. Our neighbor is a teacher at one of the local elementary schools, and her salary in Lebanese lira 2.5 years ago was worth around $1,000 a month. She's paid the same amount today, but because of the tremendous inflation in the country and the devaluation of the lira, her salary is now worth between $50 to $60 a month. In the same time, the cost of everything has inflated. Medical care, food costs have gone up 500%. So we're dealing with inflation in the US and are feeling it in our pocketbooks and bank accounts, especially for people that are on fixed incomes, trying to absorb 3 to 6% inflation. Our friends in Lebanon have had to try and figure out how to manage 500% inflation. It's mind-boggling. One of the tangible examples of that, all of us use propane gas bottles to cook with. That's how our stoves and ovens are heated. And that propane bottle, up until June of this past year, cost around 18,000 Lebanese lira. Since the summer, the price of a bottle of propane has risen to over 400,000 Lebanese lira. So for families whose income has taken a dive because of the devaluation of the lira, with that small amount of money, so my friend's salary, for example, is around 1,500,000 lira. So a third of that she has to spend on buying a bottle of propane. That doesn't leave a whole lot left for spending on fuel for her car, which has also escalated at the same level. Nor does it cover rent, which has remained the same or has gone up and is required to be paid in US dollars, which are very hard to find at this point in time. Nor does it cover the cost of medications, which have become extremely scarce. Pharmacy shelves are pretty much bare. Even trying to find medications like aspirin or Tylenol are nigh unto impossible. So now, as I come to the US and I ask my friends, is there anything I can bring back for you? Before, the response would have been, no, we're fine. You know, we can find whatever we need here. Now I get a long list of over-the-counter medications. Please bring these for us. We cannot find them. And that means that medications that are needed for chronic illnesses are even that much more difficult to find. So anyone who's living with diabetes or cancer is in a very difficult position right now. Anyone with chronic heart conditions, same thing. Everyone is trying to figure out how to use their international networks for people to bring in medications from various places in Europe or the US. Doctor networks and other medical networks are working to send medications. All of this because of the government economic collapse. So this is another piece of street art that we see now in many, many places. And you know, for us, this is part of the Lord's Prayer. We pray this on a Sunday morning. It's a part of many of our devotional lives. For people in Lebanon, it is much more than a reflexive prayer. It has become a daily plea. Give us today our daily bread. One of the food items that has been a traditional snack sold by street vendors for very little, around 1,500 lira, about $1. That same snack now costs 25,000 to 30,000 lira, which puts it out of range for anyone who has a low income. And so much of what we have experienced in Lebanon is captured in this phrase that the middle class has become impoverished, and those who were previously impoverished have become destitute. And so it is a very deeply troubling situation for which there is no clear solution in sight and no end in sight. Even as of this week, the government has failed to coordinate a deal with the International Monetary Fund. All of these, there's international partners that stand ready to help, but it's all dependent on the government implementing practices of transparency and accountability, which of course will implicate them. And so this is why they don't do it. But as a result, the country continues to be in this free fall. That also impacts the electrical sector. I mentioned that earlier of why we're in the US meeting with churches virtually rather than doing it from Lebanon. every day on the power grids that you all and I in the States take for granted. When we switch on a light switch, it's the national or state level grids that provide power for us, and we pay a bill for that. Well, in Lebanon, there's also a national grid, and you pay a bill for that, but it only provides 1 to 2 hours of electricity a day at this point in time. And that means that the rest of your electrical needs are only met through a subscription to a generator service. Well, with the escalating prices of diesel, those subscriptions have gone through the roof. So we used to pay a monthly bill that would average around 30,000 to 50,000 lira a month. That same bill, same amount of electrical usage, is now between 1,500,000 to 2 million. There's no way that a Lebanese family earning a salary in Lebanese lira can pay for a subscription of that on a monthly basis would run up. And that's just not, that is not electrical use. That is having lights on in one room at a time. That's running the washing machine once a week. So it's having your refrigerator on 24 hours a day, minus, even with the generators, you still have blocks of time where there's no power because the generators simply can't keep up with it.
There's somebody speaking it. Oh, this is the Sunday school class.
Yeah.
So I hear someone speaking. That's the kind of situation that people are in right now. And so for many families, they just simply are not able to have electricity in their homes, which means that you can't run your refrigerator, which means that food goes bad. So food poisoning is on the rise, and people are only able to buy and cook what they can eat at that particular time. You can't cook ahead. And because of the price of propane, another issue that we are experiencing is that families can no longer cook basic things like beans because beans take several hours to cook. And that burns too much propane. And so now it's things like lentils that are being utilized for protein. Meat, which used to be a part of every family's meals at least once a day, even if you were an impoverished family, now for well over 80% of the Lebanese population, they have meat maybe once a month. Not even once a week, and meat being both beef options or chicken or even fish. So it's a very subsistence kind of life now, which is not at all what the Lebanese have known ever. And so for the first time since the famines of World War I, people are going hungry in Lebanon. And that's not because there isn't food. It's simply because people cannot afford it. I mentioned the revolution that took place in the fall of 2019, and I just want to share a little bit about that because the coverage in the US showed only glimpses of this, and it was always the few times that there were dumpster fires or some kind of violence, and yet the vast majority of the time, that is not what was going on. So Thawra, the word that you see here, and you see it in Arabic on the symbol of the revolution, Thawra means revolution in Arabic. And what this meant for the Lebanese people in the fall of 2019 into the winter of 2020, before the pandemic started, was for the first time in Lebanese history, a coming together of all different religious identities, political identities, people from large cities, people from small towns, people from rural areas protesting their government, and not just gathering in large groups to protest, but also providing educational opportunities so that everyday people could learn more about the Lebanese constitution and how to pursue political change through constitutional means, which basically boiled down to calling for early elections, which is something that whatever the present government is needs to call for. So again, it goes against their self-interest to do that. But this is what the Lebanese people were calling for. In this picture, which is also downtown Beirut, just like the Thawra symbol, you see these tents in the background, and in the foreground is another piece of public art symbolizing the value that the Lebanese people place on their country and the pride that they have. This is the Lebanese flag. In this previous picture, you see a phoenix made out of steel rods here in front of the Thawra fist. This is made from the previous fist that was destroyed by one of the political parties doing the bidding of one of the members of parliament who didn't want to see the revolution continue. And so artists took the remains of that fist and made this phoenix, which has potent symbolic meaning to the Lebanese people that goes back 6,000 years in the history of Lebanon, that symbol of rising from the ashes. And this is something that we continue to hear from the Lebanese, that even in the midst of all that's going on right now, which is so difficult to even fully fathom, that yet they lean into this hope of who they've been over the centuries, of a people that continue to rise up no matter what empire has been in place, no matter what political structure has been in place, that everyday people continue to persevere. And so in these tents that I pointed out earlier, this is where they would hold these different seminars so that people could learn about their own country's constitutional process and what their rights as citizens are, what their legal avenues are. So this was a very educationally focused series of protest gatherings. It was also protest Lebanese style. And what do I mean by that? People from all different ages showed up, from infants to 90-year-olds. And so this was a multi-generational series of gatherings. And people held their everyday life events during this. So weddings took place, birthday celebrations, baptism celebrations. People brought out their barbecue grills and were grilling, and their living room furniture and stereo equipment. DJs were playing dance music. People would gather together to dance some of the folk dances that have long existed in Lebanon. So there was so much going on during these times of revolution, and it fueled this sense of hope that there could be change. And that is part of why the pandemic brought an even deeper layer of despair to the Lebanese, because it broke up the ability to gather in public and have that sense of shared energy and work towards a different kind of future. I mentioned the Beirut port blast, and this picture shows the grain silos that are by the port and the level of catastrophic damage that they sustained in that blast. This is taken at 1 year, remembering, so a year ago, August. And again, public art was a big part of that time of remembrance. And here in the foreground, you see this human figure made out of the twisted remains of warehouses that were destroyed in the port blast. And in the hand of this human figure is a dove, again, expressing that yearning for hope that lives in the heart of the Lebanese, despite all that they have experienced in the last couple of years. Another piece of public art that went up around that same time, a plea for the government to act for justice, meaning to fully investigate what happened with the port blast and hold those responsible accountable. This too has been stuck, has not moved, because of course, to hold those responsible accountable means elected officials, and it goes against their personal interests to hold themselves accountable. This is another piece of art coming out of the Beirut port explosion. And I find this one particularly inspiring. One of the ramifications of that explosion, many of the tall buildings in Beirut are glass faced. So when that shock wave moved through the city, there was literally acres of glass that shattered and fell to the streets, and it was meters deep. This is what caused a lot of the injuries and deaths was from falling glass. And yet even that, the artisans of Lebanon came and took those shattered remains and transformed them into pieces of beauty. In this case, a Christmas ornament, again, speaking to that sense of hope that remains alive in the hearts of the people, but it lives alongside of despair and discouragement and utter weariness. And so there's this tension at work. And it's part of why it matters so much that we as fellow sisters and brothers, siblings in Christ, stand with our partners to share their sorrows and to be of encouragement, that they would be fueled spiritually, emotionally, to keep on keeping on in a situation that on a daily basis is utterly exhausting. All of our partners are living with this reality that I just shared. All of their families have been impacted by this. All of their salaries have been impacted by this. One of our partners lives on the 10th floor of an apartment building. So because of the electricity situation, cannot use the elevator, because to get stuck in an elevator is not pleasant ever, but to know that that could go on for hours is just horrifying. So 10 flights of stairs every day. This is someone that has knee problems, and having to coordinate that with everything else. Our partners are also having to go out and hunt for medications for their families. They're dealing with the food price escalation. They're dealing with the fuel cost escalation. And yet they still show up every day to reach out to walk with, to encourage, to assist individuals and families that are in even worse condition than their own families. This mural, which sits downtown Beirut and is huge, it takes up a whole half of a city block, I think speaks profoundly to those tensions, that hope is what people continue to lean into. And yet they're doing that in the midst of circumstances that every day pull at despair. These are our partners with whom we most closely relate, and most of them are based in Lebanon. So the National Evangelical Synod of Syria and Lebanon, these are our Presbyterian partners in both of those countries. They're based in Lebanon. This means that pastors' salaries have declined significantly in value along with the members of their congregations. It means the schools that the Synod operates, they have 7 K through 12 grade schools that are of exceptional quality. And that supports over 900 teachers and their families. And so trying to keep those schools operational at a time when parents are struggling to cover food costs, let alone tuition costs, is one of the burdens on the shoulders of our Synod partners. And that is, of course, on top of the challenges that continue in Syria. So everything I've shared about Lebanon, our partners in Syria have been living with for 10 years. And so you can imagine the toll that that takes over that amount of time. And they've been doing that in the context of also living with the violence of war. Thankfully, from their perspective, the violent side of things in Syria has calmed down significantly as the Syrian government has regained control over most of Syria. But the economic disaster continues. The Middle East Council of Churches is based in Beirut, and part of their work right now is coming alongside of families with relief aid, but also a development focus. So they are working in the communities that are most deeply impacted by this economic crisis to help local people think through what kind of business makes sense to start at this time and how to get that off the ground in this context so that families can be self-sustaining to at least some degree. This is part of the entrepreneurial spirit of the region, and disasters like this just crush that and leave people dependent on relief aid, which is of high concern to our partners in Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon. The longer that economic instability continues, the more dependent people are on relief aid, on outside assistance, and the more that undermines the stability and the future of those countries. So Middle East Council of Churches is working on that development side. They're doing that in Syria as well. So combination of relief and development work. In addition, in both countries, they are working on trauma resiliency skills. And so providing a context for people to learn the kinds of skills that are needed to help recover from trauma, whether that is a physical trauma sustained in violence or the kind of trauma that comes from surviving the Beirut port blast, the trauma of the current economic situation. There's an escalation of domestic violence as families become more and more desperate and their coping skills diminish. And so this is another intervention to try and help give families resiliency so that they don't descend into violence against one another, which is the last thing that families need. And so this is the work that Scott is involved in, is that kind of trauma resiliency development. The Fellowship of Middle East Evangelical Churches, this is another ecumenical body. So Middle East Council of Churches and the Fellowship of Middle East Evangelical Churches, they work regionally across Northern Africa through the Mesopotamia Levant area that covers Palestine, Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. The Middle East Council of Churches works with all parts of the Christian family, Orthodox, Catholic, Oriental Orthodox, and Protestant. the Fellowship of Middle East Evangelical Churches work with the Protestant churches in that same region. And they are also doing a combination of relief and development work, especially in Syria. One of their foci there is helping people in rural communities once again have a starting herd of sheep and goats to work with. That's one of the big agricultural segments in Syria, or chickens. That's another piece, just to help local families have something that can sustain them, something that they can sell to earn some money, and it contributes to their wider community. The World Student Christian Federation works with university students throughout the Middle East. So this is Gulf states, along with Northern Africa, and all of the region that I mentioned from along the Levant and Mesopotamia area, and also into Turkey. And they create opportunities for university students to come together and think together about how they as young adults can be contributing to peace building in their countries and their country's economic future. This is so critical because what we're seeing and have seen in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon is that so many of the young people end up leaving because there's no future for them from their experience of their countries. And so World Student Christian Federation, WSCF, works with those students to help them begin to imagine how they could be involved in the future of their countries. And their countries need them. To lose an entire generation or 2 generations, as the case is in Iraq, is devastating for a country's future. Neary School of Theology, also based in Beirut, works to train pastoral leadership and Christian education leadership that serves in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, in Jordan, in Palestine and Israel. And they too are trying to help their students really understand a practical theology for working in the midst of so much suffering. The world in many ways is influenced by the prosperity gospel, which says you are blessed by God only if you experience material blessing. Well, how are people in the midst of such devastation supposed to understand the presence and work of God? That's the question that is wrestled with. And scripture profoundly speaks to that and discredits the distortion of the prosperity gospel. And so very grateful for the work of Neary School of Theology and the ways that they are equipping their students and thus future leaders in the region to be working with these issues in thoughtful, practical ways. Lebanese American University, started by Presbyterian missioners in the 1800s, has grown into an absolutely dynamic university with 2 campuses, one in Beirut and one in Byblos, further north on the coast of Lebanon. LAU has a medical school, 2 teaching hospitals, a 3rd in process, along with a School of Business, School of Architecture, School of Nursing, School of Pharmacy, design, art, interior design, all the fields of civil engineering, public policy, on and on and on, along with all of the traditional liberal arts degrees. Their footprint in Lebanon and in the region is significant, and the way in which they have navigated these 4 tsunamis that have enveloped Lebanon, I think, is just so incredibly inspiring. The team that is there, the president and vice president and deans, along with the staff and board of trustees on which I have the privilege of serving, they have been so incredibly thoughtful and deliberate throughout these disasters to be able to care for their community in a way that allows people to be able to stay. This is another issue that universities and schools and hospitals across Lebanon have had hundreds of their personnel leave because they just cannot financially survive in Lebanon. And so LAU, I think, has done a tremendous job of not only helping to retain their community, but to come alongside of families so that they can continue to send their children to the university. LAU has always had a heart for really developing a service-minded student body, and they are practicing that in some significant ways and have continued to develop their vision for the future in the midst of this. Blessed School, working with students who have a variety of different learning challenges, they have continued to work as well, equipping their students to serve the wider community in the midst of everything that is going on these days. And so they are a point of hope. Joint Christian Committee working with Palestinians in Lebanon. A lot of their work is also relief and development oriented for those communities, which is much needed because in the social stratification of Lebanon, when it comes to economics, you have the Lebanese overall, and that, of course, you have the extremely wealthy and now the utterly impoverished and destitute among the Lebanese. But then you have Syrian refugees that are also now destitute, but a little bit better off than the Palestinians who are on the bottom. And so you can see it's a very complex array of people in Lebanon that are suffering. Compassion Protestant Society, they are the diaconal arm of the National Evangelical Synod of Syria and Lebanon. And they, like Middle East Council of Churches, are working on relief and development projects. And both are also working to help people recover from the Beirut port blast in terms of housing rehabilitation. That's for those that are in buildings where glass was shattered, doors were blown out, but the building itself is still structurally sound. The huge need is for the families whose homes were utterly destroyed. And that takes a more concerted effort at a governmental level, which has not yet happened. And now that's a year and a half later. Geneseon Memorial Program, also based in the Beirut area, working with impoverished Armenians. And that number has grown in both Lebanon and Syria. The Arab Institute for Women, this is a program of LAU and historically carries forward the start of LAU, which was focused on educating women. They have a tremendous grassroots program that also empowers and builds capacity among at-risk women. And that covers a wide category from economic risk to domestic violence risk and health risks. And then the other organization based in Lebanon and working also on housing restoration and relief and development projects is the Forum for Development, Culture, and Dialogue. Their work in Lebanon has come about just in the last couple of years with the catastrophes there. The bulk of their work has been based in Syria. They've done some amazing peace building work there. They've been part of negotiating local peace agreements, along with significant development work focused especially on young adults. And then two other partners that we are beginning to develop further relationships in the Gulf. And so the Bible Society of the Gulf, who they work predominantly with migrant workers in the Gulf that come from different parts of Asia and Africa. And then the Alamana Center, located in Muscat, Oman, and they really work across religious lines, developing those kinds of collaborations, Christian-Muslim collaborations in the Gulf area. And so that includes working with migrants as well as local people. So I'm going to pause here. That's a lot that I've shared, and we have a few minutes for some interaction back and forth. I'm going to stop screen sharing for the moment. Let me see first if there's any questions, and then I'll respond to Lane's question that he raised earlier. Or comments or observations. And from the group in the classroom, you may need to have someone share the question closer to the microphone, so I make sure to hear it.
I just have a comment. I was in Lebanon on my trip to, Egypt, Israel, Lebanon, the early 2000s, and it just breaks my heart to see it.
Yes. Yes, I can appreciate that.
The most hopeful.
Yeah. Yeah, we need to continue to work with our partners on the ground who are giving their lives to helping maintain the social fabric there so that there can be a future. Lane, the question that you asked, those are challenging dynamics. Lebanon every day experiences multiple flyovers from the Israeli Air Force, along with drone invasions of Lebanese sovereign airspace. The Israeli Air Force also launches missiles from the sovereign airspace of Lebanon into Syria. So the pressures on Lebanon are immense. They've gone to the UN repeatedly to ask the Security Council to insist that Israel does not violate Lebanon's sovereignty, and yet it continues unabated. We've had those jets flying over our home. We've had missiles flying over our home. It's unnerving. And on top of everything else that is going on in Lebanon, these kinds of actions are provocative, and of course, the area is a tinderbox. And I think it's unfortunate that there's not a willingness to have a mutual accountability conversation. All of the emphasis falls on Hezbollah in Lebanon, that they are the ones at fault, and yet there's very little recognition given to the provocative actions of the Israeli government through their military. So it's hard for me to imagine how a sustainable peace can be reached, or a just peace can be reached, without addressing both sides of that equation. I think the challenge in Iraq, it's multi-generational and multi-decade. Iraq has not at all recovered from the US invasion. I find it really hard to listen to the news right now coming out of the Ukraine and the US perspective on that, especially statements being made about the right of countries to determine their own future, and yet see the ways in which our own government has violated that very same sentiment. And I realize that the contexts are different. The historical context was at a different time. And yet, as an American citizen, I feel that it's part of my work to meet with our elected officials, to call them to a higher standard, If we want to be a ethical and moral leader in the world, we need to hold ourselves accountable to a higher standard. If we want other nations to not violate international law, we need to not use our power abusively at the UN in order to rationalize our own breaking of international law. So that hits home for me. And Lebanon, the intersections economically of what's going on in Lebanon and the implications that has for Syria and Iraq are immense, because many Iraqis and Syrians opened up bank accounts in Lebanon in order to have some kind of security, financial security. And they, like everyone else who had bank accounts in Lebanon, have been frozen out of their accounts. And so what little security they thought they might have has once again evaporated. And so you have families and communities that have had to begin again and again and again and again. And that, of course, contributes to cycles of poverty because you don't have the benefit of one generation being able to bequeath wealth to the next generation, being able to pass that on to the next generation, and so on. When you have one generation that has to restart multiple times, that bleeds into the next. So a lot of our work as a Presbyterian mission agency is around these kinds of advocacy issues, so that we truly can, as a nation, be a source of hope, and not leave a legacy of destruction. You have to unmute, Lane. I didn't quite hear.
You have an email address that we can communicate with you via.
Yes, let me get back here to the slides.
And we are just about out of time, so.
Yeah.
Does anybody else want to add anything?
There we go. Okay, let me share screen here again. And that way you can see the email address. eparker.rl.isli@gmail.com. Again, eparker.rl.isli@gmail.com. And I'll pull up this next slide. Those of you who are interested can take a picture of it. This is if you'd like to be a financial partner with our partners in the work that they're doing. That is a significant way that you can help them keep on keeping on at this point until they're able to get their feet back under them.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
For your time and for all of that wonderful work that you guys are doing.
You are very welcome. It's good to be with you, and thank you for your continuing partnership with us and with our partners. I can also send this slide separately if you'd like, Stephanie, or if someone's taken a picture, then you have it.
Yeah, we can do that. I did take a picture. Thank you so much.
Okay. Take good care, all of you. Lane, I didn't hear what you said there.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you all.
Scott too.
Yes, I will do that. And we are always happy to respond to emails, so feel free to be in touch in that way. Have a good rest of your day.
You as well.
Thank you.